When you work with a provider such as LARM who has those local relationships, how important that is, because to his example of saying talking a landlord off the ledge because potentially an expat's trying to negotiate, they have that opportunity and they have those relationships set overall.
Welcome to another episode of Relocation Leader. I'm your host, Zach Turbis, and we have a special guest with us today. We have Victor Rivas, the Managing Director at LARM Group, and we have Kayla Conrad, our very own Director of Global Client Relations at NEI Global Relocation. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you, Zach.
Victor, did you want to introduce yourself to our guests, let them know a little bit about you and what you do at LARM?
Yes, thank you for having me. Happy to be here. I'm the Managing Director for LARM Group and based in our headquarters in Miami Lakes, Florida. And of course, I coordinate with all the other directors of the group for all of our services and everything that we carry out. So I have the privilege of working with basically all of our teams. And, we carry out for all of our partners, such as NEI and everything from destination all the way to all the general global mobility services that we do for you guys.
Nice. And Kayla, did you want to give our audience an introduction to you?
Absolutely. So I'm Kayla Conrad, Director of Client Relations here at NEI. My role is to help support our client relations team. We have a team of several members that work with our corporate clients to help develop policies, work together with them on industry best practice, et cetera. And my role is to help support them. And I do also wear the client relations hat as well.
Nice. Now, Victor, LARM stands for Latin American Relocation Management. Can you tell me just how many different countries that you service?
So yes, that's correct. Right now we are up to 27 countries. Obviously, all the way basically from Mexico. If you start heading down, we cover pretty much most of the locations, certainly all the high volume ones. And our latest addition has been Barbados, which is a small, tiny island in the Caribbean that we now service for both immigration and destination services.
All right, Victor, now I know I've worked with you and several clients, and I think one of the things that we appreciate best about you is your model of how you actually manage those particular countries because they are so different. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about how that works and because of the differences that we look at from country to country? Because you talk about Mexico all the way down south. There's so many nuances as you go down each of those.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, the reality is that our main focus is to try and give the clients the most consistent level of service, right? At the end of the day, that's what they want. And of course, it's easier said than done. Like you said, there's a lot of nuances and a lot of differences, right? But our main focus is just have a strong process-oriented approach where we can sort of replicate that and make sure that we standardize everything throughout all the locations that we cover. And obviously we have a strong team, systems, processes in place just to get to that point, to make sure that there's enough visibility and communication where we can replicate what works, and then we can obviously eliminate what doesn't and make sure that everyone is aware of that to make sure that we continue with that standardization that I mentioned. That's sort of the key point for us.
And I can speak to that personally because Victor and his team and I work together to implement multiple clients together. One of the most recent ones was a client came to us. We were working with them. We've been working with them for a while. And the existing model that we did as far as managing their destination services, their immigration, their temporary living, really it was feeling a little disjointed. And we were able to work together with LARM to make sure that we streamlined that process. So in doing so, we implemented, 12 different countries together, and each of those are implemented individually. And we talked about how we would manage the immigration, manage the destination services, as well as the temp living piece. So working together with them to find a solution for the client that worked best for them and implemented a model that was more streamlined. You know, as we know, when it comes to relocation, there are so many people that touch each of those moves. And by us being able to move those all under LARM's umbrella, it helped streamline that process as well as allow less people touching the file itself. So it felt very good, and it's been a fantastic support. We were also able to work through some potential cost savings for them by working and developing programs that were specific to their policies. And LARM was very flexible with us to say, here's what we would suggest based on this policy. So we took that destination services approach and made it more about what the client was needing and less about what we would traditionally see, which is a days-based program. So it really worked well.
Nice. Victor, I'm curious, what kind of industries do you find yourself serving more in Latin America?
You're going to probably hear this a lot. It varies per country. Okay. You're going to hear me say this a lot because, I mean, Latin America, obviously, as a region, right? It's part of, you know, all of the Americas basically in terms of geography. So with that comes different industries, right? So if you go all the way down south, you have a lot of mining. If you go come up more near the middle Central America region, you have a lot of tourism, right? Then you also have consumer goods as well. I wish I could say there's one particular one. We are fortunate enough that there isn't, and that's actually in a good way. But I can tell you in terms of industries, we work with banking, we work with mining, we work with obviously big multinational companies, whether it's aerospace, whether it's tech startups also. So in that sense, I actually did look up the numbers. There really isn't any standout, thankfully, you know. But again, that might have to do with the fact that our coverage is so expansive, so large that there really is something for everyone in that sense, right? You know, you go again like countries like Chile, where you have a lot of customer service oriented industries there. You have Panama, Costa Rica, where there's you know, manufacturing, especially now with nearshoring, things like that, right? So you get all of that as well. Then, of course, like I said, in terms of, you know, natural resources, even places like Puerto Rico, which we cover, right? They are the largest exporter of medical devices in the world. So you bet that we do have a lot of medical devices there as well, right? So, and again, you go to countries like Brazil, Argentina, just to name a few, then you got the big banks, right? Banking is also a big one as well, just to name a few.
Do you find, and maybe this is a question that sort of runs into each other, but do you find that some of the differences in needs, relocation needs, does it vary more by country or industry, or is it kind of like a conglomeration of both of that, you know?
I would say country first, to be quite honest, because obviously Latin America as a region, it has a lot of similarities, but in reality, it's not a monolith by any stretch of the imagination. Each country, even though, you know, they're similar, and obviously they have similar languages and things like that in a lot of cases, the reality is that each country, it's independent from the others. So there will be nuances and there will be country specific things that will sort of steer you in one direction or another, right? And I guess that would be the sort of the number one thing to do, right? If two countries have similar policies, similar, you know, situations, then you'll find some common ground there, but not really depending on the industry. I would say it's the other way around.
Can you give us any examples of maybe some of those nuances and how it plays out in real life?
You have some countries that you might have currency restrictions, and even though they're in the same location geographically speaking, they are right next to each other. even their political system, their immigration and everything, they might be very similar, but one is currency restricted. So getting money from abroad is a challenge. It's very controlled, is very restricted by the government, by their central bank and things like that, where the other one is more open and you can just move freely, your currency, your values there. So it's a lot easier to get money in and out. And that completely changes the way you're going to operate in that country, right? That completely changes what the company needs to do, how the company supports the assignees that are going to be there while they're there, right? Even how the company operates within that country, right? So that's just one of the few examples I can think of.
Well, and that's a good point, Victor. I know that we have worked together on a particular client. There are locations where part of what they do as the DSP is they have to set up that bank for the person to get paid by the local payroll. And depending upon which bank you might be working with, they might only accept foreign currency income from a specific bank. So in those cases, it's setting those expectations with those assignees to say, okay, this is the fastest place for you to get a bank so you can get on payroll, so we can get you everything moving forward, but you're not going to be able to be reimbursed for anything you've incurred until you're on payroll, because money coming from externally isn't going to make it there. So those are some of the things that we work together with our destination services, our account executives, as well as our clients, to ensure that they understand that, setting those realistic expectations going into the move.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you can have so many different situations, even from just picking up on what Kayla said, right? Just from one country to another, even just opening that bank account, you might have some regulations where you can just go with your passport, or you have other locations such as Brazil, for example, and I know Kayla is very familiar with Brazil. You need to complete your full immigration process. So it's not that you need to be approved, and even though you're in the country, until you actually complete your whole immigration process, which takes weeks and sometimes months, you cannot open a bank account. So then again, that goes back to sort of how you're steered in one direction or another, how you work with your partners, you try to set the right expectations and explain, hey, this is the situation and these are the options. Of course, we're always trying to provide viable options. And again, those options, those solutions might differ even from one client to another, because it will depend how the company wants to act, right? That will always, obviously, we have to be very flexible in that sense.
Well, and that's where, again, from a partner such as LARM, as such a strong DSP, it's very helpful when we do have situations where potentially we have a landlord who is needing funds, we're securing that. They're able to work with us to be able to pay that landlord in the local currency there and then invoice us so we can pass that through to the client. So it's very helpful. So the assignee doesn't have to come up with those funds out of pocket when they may or may not have them yet in the country. We can help support that with our DSP, and then the client and everybody is a much happier situation there, and they can get the housing they need, which is a challenge anyway, to try to find a place for yourself and your family.
I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more, Victor. Some of the housing challenges that people might experience country versus country,
Yeah, I am. Again, it will vary per country, but I can tell you some of the, highlights, as I would like to call them. But no, just picking back on what Kayla was saying, even within the country, if the country is restricted or not, you might have landlords that do not want to receive funds from abroad because the banks, whether it is because the money takes too long to arrive, or the banks charges a percentage fee, so they end up losing money, et cetera, et cetera. Like it could be many reasons where the landlord says, I need the money and I need it locally, right? That's where obviously we need to work with our partners and everything to make sure that we carry that out, right? And that is one of the just one example of some of the challenges that you might have. In general, and that is one of the very few things I can confidently say, the region itself, in terms of housing, it moves very quickly and there is never enough inventory. I can tell you that right now, especially with the pandemic, a lot of construction stopped for months. So that just only exacerbated the situation, right? Because those things obviously usually keep coming and they free up some new real estate and things like that. With the pandemic, that only got worse. So in general, there's always that sense of, because there's not enough inventory, it's a landlord's market, if you know what I mean. And the landlords know that, right? And then you have a lot of situations where, your negotiating power, it gets diluted, or it just becomes more challenging because they know, even if they don't rent it to you, there's 2 or 3 guys behind you just waiting, right? And that's something that we always use to sort of make sure that the client understands, hey, this is what's happening. In a lot of locations, especially expat friendly locations, it's a lot of investment properties, you know. So again, they're in it to make money. And again, if it's a landlord's market, they know their place in the market, so they know they have the power. So those are the things that we try to set the right expectations, make sure that they understand where we stand, right? And obviously, we always help, we always guide them, we always negotiate on their behalf, of course. But it's very important to understand that level of challenge, because in some cases it can turn a little bit confrontational. And obviously, we're always there to mediate and make sure that we take the lead to ensure that there's no friction or anything like that. And of course, that changes a lot, right? Especially if you have somebody coming from abroad, they might not know the current situation. If you have somebody, depending on their demographics, right? If you have somebody coming from a country where it's very common to try and negotiate and to haggle a little bit, right? And it's like, no, always going to ask for a discount, even if it's very little, right? Because it's very common where they come from, right? In some situations, especially when we deal with that can be a deal breaker, where the landlord is like, I don't need to deal with this, because I know there's 10 other people that want to rent, right? So those are the things that you have to be very careful. And again, setting those right expectations, understanding those things, is very important.
Well, and I think, Victor, one of the things I also want to talk about that maybe those of us who might be in the US are used to something such as the MLS or multiple listing service, where we can find options that are available, whereas that isn't something that you deal with. All of your temp living options are sourced due to relationships. And I think that's something that's important when you work with a provider such as LARM, who has those local relationships, how important that is, because to his example of saying, talking a landlord off the ledge, because potentially an expat's trying to negotiate, they have that opportunity and they have those relationships set overall. So I think you undervalue what you offer there. It's not just about the negotiation part, it's about those relationships that you have worked for years to help develop, that help support the expats and us as relocation management companies.
Yeah, in terms of sourcing, definitely. I mean, that's something that we always leverage, right? And it has, it has many parts of it, because on one hand, like Kayla mentioned, especially when we talk, I'll just talk a little bit first about the temporary accommodation situation, right? When you talk with the big, large providers of the industry, they're usually in the main cities with 1 or 2 very service apartment buildings, things like that, which is great. But again, space is limited. There's only so many of those, right? And in a lot of our locations where there is no MLS in any of the countries that we service, you just basically have to go out, do your own research, do your own sourcing, even be willing to find people that might not even want to be interested in renting short term first, and say, hey, would you be willing to do this? Would you be interested in this? Right? And kind of help source that. And of course, we have teams on the ground out every day, leveraging that and making sure that they are, we're always on top of that. And again, that's easier said than done, especially as if you have to move out from the capital, the main cities, then it gets even trickier, right? Then you might be left where you might be seeing something where there's 3 properties that would be suitable for a short-term assignment or things like that. So we have to go out of our way, make sure that we try and negotiate that on their behalf. And then of course, also vetting those properties, like Kayla mentioned, right? No MLS means anything can be put online. Uh, you have websites which show properties, but those properties might be old, obsolete. They haven't been up. The listing hasn't been updated in 6 months, so you don't know the property. You don't really know the condition, or you might see some of the pictures that you can tell they were from when the building was built 6, 7 years ago, right? And it's like, well, I need to see the property. I need to see actual recent properties to make sure that this actually makes sense, right? And that sort of due diligence is also another big part and another big challenge, right? Where, here in the US, in Europe, where you have more stable market, especially when it comes to temp housing, you have a lot of service apartments that you just basically have to make a phone call. And, you make a phone call, it's booked. You don't have to worry about it, right? Not so much on the other hand, right? So it's definitely tricky, but we make it work. We do.
Are there any like cultural themes that are pretty consistent across all of South America that you find yourself constantly trying to prepare expats to, encounter or, to deal with when they're moving?
Well, I can start to say relationships, right? It's very relationship based. I would say that once you earn the trust of somebody, then they can rely on you and they trust. They believe what you're saying. They everything there, but you need to develop that. It's not something that's automatic, and that is something that you work very hard to do with both our clients and of course our client contacts as well as our service partners there as well, is keeping each other updated and working together on those. Victor, can you think of anything else that you want to share?
I mean, definitely, I want to echo the relationship part. It's key. It's very important. In every step of the way. Even we were talking a little bit earlier, and I mentioned the pandemic and everything. Even after the pandemic, our region was one of the first ones to embrace the go back to the office, right? And it's because of that. I want to say human touch, face to face, whatever you want to call it. That part, it's cultural, right? Like you need to have that face to face. You need to look people in the eye when you shake their hands. It's definitely one of those things that it's a part of the culture that it's missing if you remove it. um, and that definitely translates into how you operate then, because how you treat them, and it's one of those things that when we try to set the right expectations with our assignees, we explain some of the cultural differences, right? In some of our locations, when you greet somebody, you give them a kiss or two, and it does, and even if you met them for the first time, it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean you have a special relationship, that there's any preference or anything like that. It's just part of the culture, right? But then again, that can also translate into building a relationship, building a connection with somebody that then you can both trust each other, and that's something that definitely goes hand in hand for sure.
There's some leadership volatility in South America, and I'm just curious how that affects kind of what you guys do and how you work around some of the different leadership changes in order to keep your service at a high level.
So, I mean, the short answer is basically going back to the beginning. We try to make sure that we have a strong process in place, regardless of whether it's government regulation. We obviously have our teams, our legal team, lawyers, paralegals, everybody to advise us to make sure that we are up to date on the latest, local laws and regulations to make sure that we are 100% compliance. That is always the case. But then make sure we have resilient processes that, regardless of how everything else, how the winds of politics might change, and they do change a lot, then that you have a process that's resilient enough that it can deliver some level of consistency, right? And again, there's obviously third parties that are acting, whether it's a government agency, whether it's immigration, things like that, right? That it are not under our control, but as long as we have the rest of the process sturdy and very well set up, then I think that gives us a little bit of resilience, as I keep using that same words because I think that's the best way to describe it, right? We try to have a very solid process with good foundations, and I know this is something we worked with Kayla in the past, where we kind of we went to the drawing board quite literally. Like we started drawing and we came up with processes and some roadmaps and things like that that we needed to come up with. We did that for every single country, and we say, hey, this is the process. This is how it applies to this client based on this level of this profile that they will be sending to this country. And this is how the process goes. We provide timelines when we can, or approximate timelines, things like that, to set that level of expectations. And then from there, we just keep going and try to keep that regardless of how the winds change. And, they do change.
Absolutely. And Victor brought up, we did for each country that we moved people into, we had a roadmap, and then we had an immigration process where it was, here's the big picture, right? Here's the big picture. Here's the minutia behind the scenes. And I think part of when things do change is that LARM is very good about is communication. Because if somebody comes in and they say, oh, by the way, now we are doing all the immigration electronically. So everything you submitted to us before now has to be resubmitted electronically, because that did happen. We
Great.
have to start over from scratch. It's that communication to say, okay, and then passing that along to the clients. Mm-hmm. So communication is key. And I think working with the country heads and them keeping us up to speed, and that back and forth really is what it is. And to Victor's point of process and being able to go back to that and just that open line of communication overall.
So I'm curious, we talked a little bit about the currency exchange and some of the different monetary needs of the transferees and assignees. Does anything else come to mind? You talked about how the banks, depending on whether the country was a little bit more open or, had more restrictions and regulations in place, that there would be, processes that you'd have to work through and, help prepare the assignee for what they might experience. Is there anything else that you can think of with, currency, monetary needs that pops into your mind?
Another one is housing cost. I think that's something, especially in the US, in Europe, where you have a more stable markets. You generally review your COLAs once a year, something like that. In our situation or region, it varies so much, and it's very volatile. Generally on the upside, but it's very volatile, and we always recommend and we provide that to our partners, all the time. Kayla and her team, we provide updates about the housing, because again, with the real estate market, with the lack of inventory, it can vary a lot. I can't remember the last time we only did a revision about our housing costs, for example, once a year. We've done it we do it at least twice a year. And in some years, we've had to do it 3 times, right? And so because of that, I think that's another key point where it's very important for the client and the customer to be aware that the region is very volatile in that sense, and we always try to provide that update as much as we can in all the main cities, in all the hotspot locations for expats and for people moving in and out, whether it's maybe there's a new location that's popping up that it's developing, that we know, hey, this is going to come up, and this is going to obviously affect the rest of the real estate market. I talked a little bit about construction and things like that. When those developments are finished, then immediately that will have a ripple effect on the rest of the market, right? That will have an effect, whether it's that it will create more competition, so prices go down, or it will make it more premium, so the high end, the VIPs, the higher band that's moving will probably have to pay more, but that might free up a little bit more space for the mid to low end tier that's moving, right? So that is definitely another aspect that I think it's worth mentioning in terms of things to consider. And it's just that it's very volatile. It varies a lot, and you want to make sure you always have your latest. I would say right now, I would say no more than 4 months old. Make sure that you check that. If it is a little bit more, always check up with us. Make sure we'll tell you if not. again, if things slow down or anything, 6 months is safe. It'll give you a good approximation, a good estimate. But right now, again, we're trying to do it every 4 months just to make sure that we keep up with the changes in the market.
Well, and on that point, Victor, a lot of our clients utilize third-party service, and they update those housing tables that he's talking about for the housing, and they update it whether it's a semi-annual, annual, in some cases quarterly basis. But again, that data is based on historical data. So by the time it comes through, it's not necessarily current data. So by utilizing, we have a lot of clients who look to us to help support them with what we are seeing that is more active. And that's where LARM comes in, and they say, okay, here's what's really happening in the market. I would say comparing it to an appraisal versus a broker's market analysis here in the US. So the broker's market, they're seeing what's happening, and they say, here's what we see right now, versus an appraisal. They have to do some forecasting because they have to base it on closed sales. So those third-party companies are more like the appraisals without the forecasting, because they don't offer that, versus LARM is more like our real estate agents that go out there and really feel what that market is and are able to share that information with us, which is more relevant, especially in the volatility that we're seeing there. So it's very much appreciated, and our clients really support that, and they can go into it with eyes wide open, understanding here's how much we should expect to spend on our housing.
Especially in those situations where, again, when you want certain level of exclusivity or certain level of threshold where, whether it's that you want to be in a very prime location, things like that. We've had, you have expats that say, okay, I want to live in these 2 blocks. Well, in these 2 blocks, there's 4 buildings, and we do all the rents, so we know what the price is going, right? So we can tell you, and we're very good. We always keep an open line of communication with the operations team and everybody. But we say, hey, this budget is not realistic, right? And again, depending on how things are going, if you go to Rio in end of January near the carnival, we don't recommend it. But if it happens, then you're gonna have to pay a premium. That's just the reality, right? If you find, because there's people there that will really not want to rent you for a year, 6 months, 2 years, because they know they can make it all up in 3 weeks with the carnival, right? So those are the type of situations where it's always good to sort of keep that in the back of your mind, that, hey, you might need to just touch base and check to make sure that you see sort of the facts on the ground, as we call it.
I keep offering to go visit my clients in Brazil, and I try to offer during Carnival so I can actually experience it, but thus far it hasn't been approved, but I'll just keep pushing that forward every time.
It's like, this would be a good time.
Yes.
I'm curious so do you have any stories that really sort of illustrate, signature regional differences and sort of like how you guys have operated and there's been good outcomes because of maybe what you guys have done?
I'm trying to think of a couple of, we've got a few, but I will say that LARM worked together with us in a situation with a client where we were trying to figure out a model to help solve and keep their costs down. So they adopted some of the administrative function working directly with the client that we were able to do, and NEI support that and be able to work with the client to meet their needs, as well as keep the client's costs down. So really partnering on that side, that's one thing I can think of, and that has to do with money changing across border and the taxes as we export it. So by working with them directly, we kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, Victor, where we talked about the fact that the landlord's not wanting to receive that. In some cases, the cost for the services that are rendered, being able for LARM to work with local providers and make those payments on their behalf to them, thus saves the client money, and they don't incur that cost, and we're able to pay them directly. So there's significant cost savings in that side by their local presence being able to, in this case, it was Brazil specifically, because they have a significant VAT. What is it, Victor? Like 40 or 60%, I think, when you go outside of there. So they were able to support that significant additional cost to be able to pay those local providers, and then we're able to pay them. So it's a significant cost savings there for us as well as the client.
Yeah, I mean, it can be pretty high. It varies. Another thing we've also encountered is the situation where even from a tax perspective, the company might be the one interested. Not so much the landlord. It might just be the company from a cost center perspective, right? Where they say, hey, if we do this locally, then we're able, obviously, to, from a tax perspective, we're able to get certain benefits and things like that. So that's something that we also obviously work together to generate those benefits, to make sure that they are, taking care of that and taking advantage of that whenever possible. It's a lot of moving parts always, and I always tell our clients and our partners, it's not an exact science, because even the way that the company is registered in the country can affect your ability to do something like that, right? So in that, when I say it's not an exact science, that's what I mean. But it's always that level of being able to find those alternatives and solutions.
Well, and I just thought of another one, Victor, that when we together implemented the first client that I had the fortunate of working very closely with LARM through, we did some HR training. And part of what we did is we put together a slide deck and we put it in English and Spanish, which was under our scope of being able to do here at NEI, but we did not have the Portuguese piece of it. And so we were able to, with LARM's local team, we worked together, we developed the presentation, and they were able to work with us and also be a part of that presentation to be able to present that in Portuguese to the local HR partners along with our client contact. So again, a story of working together, partnering. We had it in 3 different languages, so those who were more fluent in the different languages were able to understand that, but LARM being able to support us and support the training of the HR team by offering that additional information for us in Portuguese. So.
Yes. Do you guys find that you have to work creatively rather often?
Yes, we do. We do quite a bit. I could probably think of a lot of different stories, but those are the 2 that stand out probably the most, especially as at an important part when you're onboarding a client and different HR partners. It's a completely different model we're going with. We need them to understand it in order to do so, speaking in their native tongue. Although the expectation is that everybody can speak English, they may or may not understand. If you can get to their level in their native tongue, it makes it a lot easier, and they pay attention more and will ask questions too.
So I was wondering, do you have any more questions for Victor?
I don't think so. Just it's good to see him, and I'm hoping he's going to come join us at our talent at our GPA summit again this year. It was nice to see him last year.
I will be there. For sure.
Nice. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on the podcast and, engaging in this discussion with us. I think I certainly learned a lot. I'm waiting for my trip. Did you say Barbados was where you guys are now working?
That's the latest one, yes.
Yeah, maybe we need to go check that out.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for joining us on another episode of Relocation Leader. Thank you for listening in. If you haven't subscribed for our all access, where we have articles, white papers, past conference sessions, and much, much more, make sure you go do that at neirelo.com. And then if you haven't scheduled your time to join us at our Talent Agility Symposium, and if you're a service partner that would like to join us for the GPA Summit, so make sure you get yourself there in Omaha, Nebraska. Once again, that's another episode of Relocation Leader, and we want to thank you for listening.